And with that, I want to say welcome to today's local government education program. This is the second in this year's education series. It's entitled Rural Education Issues and Advocacy. It's brought to you by University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, the voice of rural Illinois. My name is Mike Delaney. I am an Extension Community and Economic Development educator based in Ogle County up here in the northern state line region. Going to begin with some quick housekeeping details. You're probably familiar, well too familiar with these. First, if you'd like, you can activate Zoom's closed captioning functioning at the bottom of your screen with the button, the appropriate button, the CC button. We will be recording today's webinar, as I mentioned. We'll be making it available on our Community and Economic Development YouTube channel. But after the conclusion of today's presentation, we will be sending out links to that video as well as to slides and other reference materials that are used in the presentation. If you didn't register for today's presentation, please drop, and you'd like to receive these materials, that's fine. Just drop your email into the chat and we will know then to add you to the mailing list for those materials. As always, you're welcome anytime to share your questions in the chat box. We will have a Q&A after the conclusion of Mr. Ardrey's remarks, and we'll address those questions at that time. Now, I'm going to introduce Laura Hep-Kessel, who is a member of the board of Rural Partners. Laura?
Thanks, Mike. Laura Hep-Kessel here. I'm the Executive Director of Telehealth Services at the SIU School of Medicine and also serve as the immediate past chair of Rural Partners. If you're not familiar with Rural Partners, we are the state's Rural Development Council. We have a volunteer working board. We rely on membership and involvement from our members. We try to connect people with resources. So if you're not familiar with our organization, we will put a link to our website in the chat so you can learn more. We're always looking for more people to get involved who are living in rural areas, concerned about issues in rural areas, and just want to do more focused on rural Illinois. Want to thank U of I Extension for partnering with us to offer this webinar series. This is the second in a three-part series on rural education in Illinois. We have another webinar scheduled for next week, so we hope you can join us. And we had a webinar last week that the recording is available online, and Extension has made that available. So please go back and take a look at that and consider joining us next week. I'm now going to turn this over to our speaker today, Dave Ardrey. Dave is the executive director of the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools. He's been in that role for about 12 years. He's also been serving for the past 6 months or so with the National Rural Education Association as their interim executive director. So he wears a lot of hats. He's had a lot of great experience in rural education over the years. I had the pleasure of working with and meeting Dave when he was with SIU Carbondale a number of years ago. And we're really happy that you're here with us, Dave, and we're looking forward to you telling us about some of the work that you're doing and kind of where things are at with rural education. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks a lot. And Laura for the introduction. Really great to see all of you this morning. This is really easy for me to talk about. I apologize that the slides aren't available, but it's really been kind of my life's work, honestly. And now the last 15 to 20 years, truly a passion of the work that I've done. And so to start back a little bit, I was at SIU Carbondale for 30 years. The last 10 to 15 years of that working specifically in rural education and rural partnerships and support, predominantly in the K-12 area, and to provide resources to them and access to higher ed supports and other resources. And so that led to an opportunity to move into the executive director role with the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools. You'll hear me refer to it as AIRSS, AIRSS. They have been in existence since the early 80s, formalized in 86 and 87 at Western Illinois University, which still remains our home and our partner today. I happen to live downstate, and we had a joint partnership with SIU Carbondale and Western for a number of years while I still finished out my work and my time at SIU. But we've always had strong relationships with higher ed, with our community college partnerships, and then obviously working with K-12. When I took over the organization, the board had just made a shift in kind of their goals and mission, and their goal and mission was to become the voice of rural education in Illinois and do it from the advocacy lens. And what did that mean? How do we help? Well, what it really meant was twofold. For decades, and many of our longtime rural educators and rural administrators will share this story. For decades in this state, rural education really didn't have a voice at the state level in policy and advocacy work. And much like healthcare, much like rural ag, much like uh, rural economic development, many times left on the sidelines to those conversations, and also left to the policy that oftentimes comes above the I-80 corridor and in that Collier County area of Chicago. And so our board really felt it necessary to put our foot in the door of policy work. And it was new. It was new, and it was new for us to bring a voice to the table. It surprisingly initially met with resistance, and understandably, change is hard for people. And it was easy when we didn't have a voice and come to the table with a voice. And policy would be adapted to fit the needs of our rural state. I think also there's a bit of a confusion, and I've learned this now across this country. We are what I would call an urban-centric state. There are a lot of our population live in Chicago and above the I-80 corridor. And when you travel or when you meet people new to your life, when you say you're from Illinois, they say, "Oh, Chicago." And so a lot of people aren't aware of what our state looks like, both from a national scope, but even at the state level, people not understanding the scope and size. And so we began the journey of developing kind of a platform and a plan for doing advocacy work. What we knew that we had to have was a voice. We knew there had to be some kind of a consistent voice. And we knew that we had to begin by building really strong relationships. And we had to do that with the General Assembly across the board. And we had to work across the aisle on both sides. And we had to work top to bottom, east to west with the state, so we could begin to educate people. And in fairness, I'll tell you, we even had to educate our own schools at times. I would give presentations at districts, and districts would push back a little and say, "Well, I'm not really a rural school," and I would have to remind them to look out their windows and maybe look at the landscape and look at their economy and tell me, what does that look like to you, and how would that not fall within a rural confines, if you will. And so about 5 years ago, we started looking at solidifying some sort of a voice on behalf of rural education. And we did that through a piece of legislation. It took about 2.5 years to pass. The first year and a half was very challenging for us and very uh, a big education of learning how to navigate Springfield and navigate the General Assembly and understand those relationships. But we had great teachers. We had great support from representatives and senators who were willing to help us. Senator Kaler carried the bill for us from the beginning to the very end. Then Senator Monar helped us write the legislation before he left the office and went into the governor's office. And we had a couple of state reps that really stepped up for us throughout the time on the House side to help. And so the Rural Education Advisory Council was passed 2 years ago. That council is made up of rural educators by definition across the state, utilizing a mapping system that gives equity and parity across the state for folks to be a part of that. It's an appointed council by the state superintendent and with recommendations made from various constituent groups. That group has now been in place for about 8 or 9 months, meeting on a regular basis, meeting every 3 months. And we were very sensitive in that legislation to know that sometimes these councils, commissions, task force are very time consuming and difficult for the state to manage. And then there's compliance issues. And we wanted to make this a working group. We wanted this to be a relationship group with the state agency. And so we worked very closely with them to make sure that it was. And And we're very proud of the work that's happening right now. And we're looking at a number of issues. One of those is looking at a very specific definition of rural in Illinois. So not only in the state, but also nationally, that definition can help us when we look for funding and we look for policy and we look for support. And so that's an overview of why we thought the voice was important and how to solidify that. What I want to share quickly is what I call my elevator speech about Illinois, because I find oftentimes that even if we live here, sometimes we don't know these numbers. And so we use data from the federal government that's derived from the National Center for Educational Statistics. It's called the NCES locale codes. Those locale codes define school districts across the country, and they define them by urban, suburban, town, and rural. They use a numbering coding system, and that coding system then provides data to show who and what districts in your state represent each category. For us, I kind of use a 5-3-4 or 5-4-3 method for you to help you understand this. About 500 districts in the state of Illinois are defined by the definition of rural. About 400 of those districts fall under the category of the locale codes of 41, 42, and 43, which are defined as rural, fringe, distant, or remote. What that means is how far am I from an urban area or an urban cluster, and then I'm defined in that remote, in reverse order, remote, distant, or fringe. So I might be up in the St. Louis area, which is an urban area, and I come down the river in Illinois, and the farther I get away from that urban cluster is defined as those rural data points. And so we have a significant number of students that attend rural schools in Illinois. That student population fluctuates. As you all know, it fluctuates in all of our districts. The number that's especially and at a state level is somewhere between 18 and 25% of children attend a rural district. Nationally, it's even a little bit higher than that. That average bumps up a little bit. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 children attend a rural district. So if you're trying to educate friends of yours, 20% of students plus attend a rural or small school in the state of Illinois. So that gives you a little background of Illinois. If you look at us from a landmass, I believe about 92% of our land mass is defined as rural in the state. And that can be anything from our orchards to our farming ground to our state and national park, federal park land. But we are a significant state, and we compare. I just had a conversation this morning about this, that the 4 states really in this country that kind of fall in that urban centric rural context would be New York, California, Texas, and Illinois. And so that gives you a picture of what this might look like for you. So that's who we are. What does that mean? And what are we looking for in terms of trying to support those rural districts as an association? Well, we look at those issues that are important to them, not necessarily important to our board or to us. We try to listen to our constituents and our superintendents and our districts and our board members, and to learn more about what their concerns are. This is no secret, and I see we have a senator with us. I can see at least one senator on the call. School funding, top of the list, and rural districts have really struggled over the last 10 years, or well, the last several decades, honestly. I was a part of the evidence-based funding formula group. That group was started back under the Round administration under Beth Purvis, bipartisan, bicameral work to develop a funding model that both provides equity, but also tries to bring districts below that 60% level up to the equitable number. And it would be no surprise to you that our urban-based friends and our rural friends were on the lower end of those numbers at times. I worked very closely with Chicago Public Schools in the early days related to school funding and resources because of this reason. One, if a child lives in poverty, if you look in their eyes, you don't know where they live. You don't know if they're an urban or a rural child. You just know that they live in poverty. If they live in an educational poverty environment, you don't know where they live. You just know they live in an educational poverty environment. And that's our job to solve that. That's to make sure that our students have the equitable funding to provide a high quality education for them. And it has been a fight that we have been a part of from the very beginning. The second one is teacher shortages, and honestly, I stood on the stump and was screaming about teacher shortages in rural districts long before any reports were ever issued, because in our rural districts, low pay impacts the ability to retain and hire high quality teachers. And like any good Baptist church, if you want to steal sheep, you don't steal sheep from 3,000 miles away. You just go to the field next door, find the best teacher, offer them more money, and they move to the district next door. And so those are issues that we've paid very close attention to. I still have concerns about teacher shortages. The gap in salaries still exists. And so that competitiveness of recruitment still exists in our state and honestly surrounding states. We see a lot of teachers poached into Illinois or out of Illinois into Indiana, Missouri, and other places. And so that rural teacher shortage gap, and honestly, a little bit like our urban friends as well, that gap will remain because those are tough jobs. And they're tough jobs for some of the same reasons, and they're tough jobs for different reasons. Housing being a challenge in some of our rural places. There just aren't houses available in the communities where jobs exist. Low pay still exists. So those are the issues that we look at. Those are two primary issues that we've really paid close attention to. We also, as mentioned, I'm on the national board for the National Rural Education Association. Those two topics have been at the forefront of every state that we work with around this country. We've all faced it. We all face the same issues in terms of school funding. How we solve those a little different, but Illinois has at least made significant strides in trying to improve school funding. One sidebar note I'll share with school funding that we started working at on a national level. I know it impacts every state differently, but it still impacts every state. And it's very dear to my heart. I started as a special education teacher. My career was in a classroom with special needs children. I spent 5 years in that classroom until I started to make changes in my career. But my heart still remains in that classroom. And one of the things that we've done very poorly in this country is our funding to support children with special needs under what's called IDEA funds. IDEA funds at the federal level have been funded historically at about 14% of the required amount. And I see somebody popped in the chat 10%. I've seen numbers as high as 16, which is not an impressive high number. But here's the thing to understand about that. When the federal government doesn't uphold their end of the bargain for school funding, and we are working to replace funds in our state funding model with evidence-based funding, if there's a gap, it still has to be filled. And on IDEA funding and children with needs, it is federal law to support those children. So, yes, we have put money back into the system to improve funding, but those superintendents have to make tough choices and say, well, we got more money this year, but we still have a big gap in our IDEA funding. And so we're going to pull from somewhere to take care of that. And, you know, while schools are a public good, they're a business, and they're a multi-million-dollar business that superintendents have to make serious decisions about. Where do I make my cuts? How do I find the resources? And so I thought it was important to share a little bit about how federal funding can impact state funding, especially in the area of our students with special needs. I do want to get to a little bit of a discussion about career technical education. We have heard for a number of years about what is perceived to be some inequities around career technical ed in our rural places. And we were asked by the state agency to partner with them about just shy of 2 years ago to begin to do a study around career technical ed in rural places based on the equity lens and the services that we're able to offer. We've made significant strides in this state and we've invested significant money, but we're really still falling short because it's really difficult to provide all of the needed resources to provide high quality career tech programs in each and every small community that exists. So then you begin to think about how do we partner? Who do we partner with? How do we create these collaboratives? How do we create these career centers? All well and good. There's some great work being done. We are studying this at a very high level. A colleague that works for me now, John Glasgow, is doing just unbelievable work around that. We have a report that I'll make sure is also included in the slides to share with this group to show where we're at right now. But the real challenge is that the regular schedule for classrooms in everyday school and the requirements that we continue to add to for graduation, they begin to erode away the ability for a student to find any time in their schedule to then find a career tech program. And then if they don't have it and they need to travel, there's just no way. If a student needs a half a day to be out of the regular building to accommodate a high paying job opportunity, their regular requirements are not going to allow that for them. And now we've added some additional requirements that make it more and more difficult. And so I think we're going to have to relook at how we handle our classroom schedules, how we handle some of the requirements that we're asking for. How do we merge some of those requirements together for students that it makes sense for? Perfect example of a student is working in a field that has math heavily embedded in the career tech side. Is there a way to combine their math requirement and their career tech requirement together so that content meets the requirement, but they're not disparate courses from each other. They're embedded in each other. And so we have a very good advisory council that's working with us on the CT project, a number of people from industry who are helping us look at what their needs are. What do you need for a high quality employee? And how do we integrate that into our classrooms? How do we integrate that into our schedule? And I saw someone dropped in the chat block scheduling. Great possibility and great opportunity. And then flexibility in the scheduling as well. So how are we flexible? And then honestly, it comes back to funding. Do we have the resources? Do we have the money to develop these programs and then support the needs of students? And so it all is intertwined together. It links together. If you map it out, you see ties between the regular curriculum, the additional curriculum, the day in the classroom, the schedule for the school, the availability of facilities, the lack of facilities, the partnership with a community college, maybe a career center comes into play. And so all of these things are tied together. And so the work we're doing right now is to try to do some CTE mapping and equity lens review and get a better understanding of where we are in our state. We know that the next administration at the federal level is going to present some challenges for us in policy. But what I know about and what we know nationally about the next administration is that they have a very career technical education, education to jobs mindset. And we believe there's going to be some opportunities there, both at the state and federal level, to look at funding opportunities. And so we're very hyper vigilant right now to make sure we're building a relationship where we can find where those resources will come from. And they may not come just from the education side. They may come from the labor side. They may come through economic development side, because there's a different perspective on how you train workers than just from a classroom or just from an education perspective. So we have to broaden our thinking and broaden our scope on who our relationships are with, and then where that support or those funds might come from. And so I will shift briefly to the national level, and then I think I'll stop for a moment and give you a chance to ask some questions or provide some insight on some of the things I said. On the national scale, I served on the board for the last 10 years. I served as president in 2023, and then just recently, since September, our executive director made the choice to step down, and we were in the process of a search, and the board asked if I would consider the interim position. I did consider it, and I did accept it. I now question my insanity some days. The depth of that work and the breadth of the work that my friend and colleague did was way, way, way beyond my expectations. And then you throw in a presidential election, and you throw in a transition of leadership, and you throw in a national conference that was happening a month after I took the position, and a national conference we're planning for next October, um, and membership and everything else that goes with that. It really was a challenge. The upside is that I have found our board leadership to be just incredible. And I've worked really hard in my presidency to get our board to understand how important it was for them to be a working board and a working leadership board, not a board that sat back and expected just one person to carry the load of a national organization. And so we're we're very engaged in very significant policy work that is at the national level. We have 42 state directors who are state affiliates who we meet with on a monthly basis, who are also sharing input with us about each state. This won't be a surprise to any of you, but it wasn't a surprise to me, but it was intriguing to me. You would think there would be a lot of things that we're alike about, and there are a lot of things that are very different about each state and each state's perspective and each state's policy and each state's operation around rural education. I mean, the obvious for me was Montana and Illinois would be very different in their conversations about rural. In Illinois, we talk about a rural definition, and in Montana, they say if you live in Montana, you're probably a rural. We obviously have a little different perspective we have to look at. And so I'll hold this position over the next few months. Our search is underway. I'm excited. My understanding is that we have a really strong candidate pool. I've separated myself from the search for some very obvious reasons, but I understand that they are in the process of interviewing, and hopefully by, March, April, May, I'll be able to culminate my term as executive director, and hopefully have held the thing together till we move into a new director. We have already started. I was surprised, honestly. I spent all of Christmas on the phone with legislative advocates and support folks. I wonder sometimes if Congress works, and I'm telling you, they were working and they were moving, and there were bills passing that were significant. To that note, I want to share one I'm really proud of. And I worked on this as a state affiliate before I really took this national scale office. But fortunately, taking that director's position put me at the forefront of the end of it. There is a piece of legislation that passed Congress over the holidays, and it was based upon the Social Security system and a thing called the WPO or the OPO, which essentially was a windfall provision related to people who draw pensions. And I'll give you a personal example. Yes, I am a state pensioner. Yes, I paid into that pension, and the state supported me as well. But my Social Security was cut 40% because I took a state pension. I paid into that Social Security system long before I became a state pensioner. I worked in the private sector on two different occasions. And I'm very proud of both my careers. But what I'm also proud of is I did my part. I paid my part. And so over the last 18 years, there have been a number of attempts to reverse that decision. And this past year, in a bipartisan effort with two representatives on each side of the aisle, they found a couple of really strong loopholes in the process that they were able to get it to the House, get it moved through the House with a very significant vote. About 261 or 281 sponsors were involved over the holidays from the House. And much like the Illinois House, it's big. So getting 281 people to agree to anything sometimes is a challenge. And then it went to the Senate. And so Christmas I spent basically visiting with leadership from the Senate and encouraging them and answering questions and explaining to them that while you may think, and I understand this does put a strain on the system, But what it does in a practical sense is a woman who visited with me at Thanksgiving who retired from a $28,000 a year job in a state job as a support staff person intended to rely on the support of her Social Security from her previous career, only to see her pension or her Social Security cut, and said, it changed our lifestyle. We have to change the way we do things because we don't have the resources to pay our bills. And so we worked very, very diligently over the holidays with the Senate. They did pass that bill. I'm very proud of that work. It affects a lot of folks who were in the service sector, teachers, support staff type folks, in some cases, street workers, uh, in some cases, fire and police, depending on how their pensions were set up, because they're very unique in their own systems. But we worked across the aisle and we worked across sectors of the industry to get that passed. And now in Illinois, our folks will see those Social Security benefits restored to them. So while you think a state director might only be focused on a state issue, our state directors are working across the state lines to talk about issues that impact schools and teachers and educators and children across the board. And so that's just a piece of the puzzle of who we are in Illinois, uh, and the work that we're doing right now. I'll stop for a minute and give my mind to rest, and I'll be happy to. I know there's questions in the chat, and maybe somebody can help grab those if I can't see them. And then anyone that wants to pop on, please do. And if you would, just introduce yourself and tell me maybe what sector or where you're from.
Sure, David. I'll draw your attention to one question that was posted here at the very end of the chat. Carolyn had referenced block scheduling. She adds the question, not sure if this is relevant to this call or not, but curious how early childhood fits into the rural education agenda.
Great question. And thanks for reminding me something just simply absolutely dear to my heart. If you live in a rural area, in a rural community, you know that early childhood is an interesting dynamic in a rural area, oftentimes provided in home, private type opportunities, oftentimes provided through churches, sometimes provided through community service organizations that find a way to create opportunities. I'm a proponent of, and if we believe the data, and I do, by the way, if we believe that the most impactful part of a child's life is their first several years of their life in their educational system, then our goal should be to provide them the highest educational opportunities at the earliest point we can in their life. And so for us, we're very supportive of any and all improvements. We're very supportive of funding for early childhood, and we're very supportive of, I'm very supportive of the opportunity for public education early childhood as well. This is a number of years ago. It dates back to the early Rauner administration. We went to a school in Missouri that combined all education, birth through, in their one public school or in a public school. And I had a couple of the education folks from the Rauner administration go with me to see it, and they were just blown away by the work. It was incredible to me to see the interaction among the age levels, the growth of children in, say, 5 years and below, seeing language development, seeing interaction and skill development, seeing interpersonal relationships grow. And so we are very supportive of it. We know education is expensive, and we understand that. And we understand the states are always challenged to find the resources. But I do believe that if we can start early and we have a highly successful educational system, we will begin to solve some of our other problems. We will solve some of our poverty. We will solve some of our pipeline to prison problems. We will solve some of our health issues. We will solve a number of things that children with high quality educations at an earlier point will be able to support them in their growth. And so I hope that answers the question. The person that posted, if you have information to share, jump on.
Hi, my name is Bridget English with Birth of Five Illinois, and I just want to tag on to the conversation and link it back to what you were talking about with special education and the gap in funding and IDEA funds and how that trickles down. We find out in the rural areas that early intervention, which is our special education home visiting system for birth to three, is really in dire need of workforce, and they're not getting reaching some of the kiddos that they need to reach. And what it's creating, I believe, and what I've heard from administrators and program directors at the early childhood level, it's kind of creating a backlog because many of the delays that could be remediated before they come into the pre-K classrooms are not being remediated. So that when they get to the pre-K classroom, they're either just now starting an IEP process or they're bringing over an incomplete IFSP from EI. I know that's a lot of acronyms, but I'm hoping that we can boost the workforce there in the EI sector in order to give some relief to the special ed programs in the districts. And then the only other thing I would mention is the loss of the ECA's funding. It didn't completely go away, but just as it was starting to make an impact here in West Central Illinois, it was cut. And so we are seeing places try to scramble to fill the gap. But I just wanted to put a plug in for those two things out here in my neck of the woods that I think would be extremely helpful up and down the spectrum in terms of education.
Yeah, I appreciate, Bridget, I appreciate your comments. I spend a lot of time in West Central Illinois now, more than I used to, because of our offices there at Western, and my colleagues now are starting to spend more time working from that sector. That the ECACS, that really was troubling to us. That, as you said, it seemed to be gaining momentum and showing some success and showing some support, and then it felt like the rug was pulled. And so we did advocate for that. We did really work hard to try to see if we could salvage some of that funding, and sadly we weren't successful. I think that's the hardest thing I've learned about working in legislative work, and Senator Ventura, you probably know this better than I do, but you win and you lose, and you have to learn to understand how to accept the losses and then figure out, how do I go back to the drawing board and start over. The losses have been the hardest part for me. Just not understanding, selfishly, why wouldn't we think education is the most important thing in the world to fund, and then make it the largest priority we can. But I'm selfish. I grew up in that area, and my grandmother was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. That's probably how I ended up in education. I didn't attend that rural one-room schoolhouse, just so you all know, but I was aware of it, and so I think I'll share this. My comment, generally speaking, when we work in policy area, is that across our state and others, is that we have to make education the priority and use that as the basis for supporting many of the rest of our programs, which might actually improve because we've improved the education of our children and our workforce, and we improve the quality of life for people. So for me, it's the basis for the success of a state really is at the base level of its education programs.
David, one of the topics, obviously, in the title is advocacy. How can folks in the field across the state, support the advocacy work of your two organizations?
Really great question. We've learned a lot in the last 3 years at the federal level, which we now are starting to implement at the state level. So NREA, as a national organization, believe that its most success would be to be in DC and hire lobbyists and be in the Capitol and be in their offices and be in their ear and in their face. And actually, what we've learned with the congressional delegates over the last 3 years is that it's great that you come here, and it's wonderful that you introduce yourself, or maybe you already know many of our folks. But for them, what they shared was, get to know the local office of your congressional delegate. Know who's working in that office. Know who's working at the local level on your local issue that matters to you, to then help that office in DC begin to build a coalition of partners or build a plan for that work. And so Senator Kaler was really clear with us in the first year when our bill did not pass, and there were some interesting dynamics for that I didn't understand. His comment to me was, he said, "You have some political work still to do." And that's all he would say initially. And so I reached out to him and just asked him to share with me his thoughts on that. And really, it was the same idea. Get into your local offices, truly make it a grassroots conversation. Because if you can't educate the people at the local level about the problem you're trying to solve, they can't educate their rep or their senator, who can't educate their colleague, who then has to convince the rest of their colleagues and the leadership that this is an important issue. So my mindset was always that, well, I guess I have to know the governor and I guess I have to know the leadership. No, you know what? I need to know the policy advocate on education in that rep or that senator's office and begin to build that relationship to help them understand that this is a grassroots conversation about what we need and what kind of help we need. And then they'll help me educate the senator's office. They'll help me get to the representative. And so what I would encourage people to do is be engaged at the grassroots level. Know who your local senators and your representatives are. Know who their office staff are. Know who their policy advocate is. If you're a business person, you better know who cares about business in that delegate's office. If you're an education person, you better know who cares about education. And then build your case, build your relationship, build out the definition and information that they need to understand. Again, as I shared earlier, I was kind of surprised at how many schools I visited that didn't really know they were rural initially, until I began to share with them the definition of rural and began to tell them the data. The other thing I will share, and I've learned this the hard way, I can sit down with Senator Ventura and we can have a conversation that turns into dialogue, that turns into maybe an argument that might get heated and maybe it doesn't. But at the end of the day, if I didn't bring substance to the table and I didn't have data to share with her that made any difference in the world, then all I did was have a good argument. And I can have a good argument any day of the week with anybody sometimes. So I began to understand the value of knowing the data, knowing the definition of our rural schools, knowing that we have 500 schools, knowing that we have 400 that are defined rural, knowing that 300 of those receive federal funds called REAP, REAP, which is a little pot of money that the federal government given strictly to rural schools for them to use for those things they don't have money to help them. Not a huge amount of money to many of you. Many of you would hear that number of a district and think, well, that's not a big deal. But to that district, it might be a teacher's aide. It might be a support person to a child with disabilities for that semester. And so it's data driven. Go to the table with information, not just an argument about how important something is to you.
And since we actually have a representative from a district office on the call, sorry to put you on the spot, could you give kind of the corresponding advice on what would be helpful coming into an office in the state legislature for information about educational needs?
Yeah, so our district is actually, we are north of Interstate 80, but so I work in the senator's office. I'm not the senator, but it is helpful when constituents come in if their concern is about whatever it's about, that they have that backup information, kind of like you were stating, helping us know what it is that you're looking for and how we can help you kind of achieve that. So having those specific asks with that specific data really helps us kind of help and further those propositions and the aid along that we need.
Terrific. Thank you. Good input and good confirmation of what David has just shared.
Mike, I think one thing I'd like to add, and with Laura on the call, I'd really be remiss if I didn't. It would be a sad mistake on my part. On the education side, I also know the value and importance of the relationship between rural healthcare, rural agriculture, rural economic development, and then our rural education areas. And the reason those are valuable is this. In many of our communities, the rural school may be the largest employer, and they are a significant portion of the economy. We've done a recent study to look at what's the economic impact of a rural school in a community. Because what I want to understand is what's the turnover of that dollar? We only think about schools as a tax consumer as opposed to a consumer of goods. They're buying vehicles, they're buying lawnmowers, they're buying services for their children, they're buying goods and services for their building, they're buying food. They're spending money in our state, and they are also putting money back into the economy through their employees. By the same token, the significant partners to that community for survival is to have healthcare, to have strong ag relationships, to have strong economic development relationships. We always purport that if you lose your school, you will lose your community. And if any of you want to test me on that theory, get on any two-lane highway in Illinois in rural places and write down the number of empty school buildings and towns with very few people left in them because that school either closed or was consolidated or simply just died, and the community slowly died with it, which then in fact causes the rest of that puzzle to begin to die as well. The last thing I'll say about the healthcare, I am a huge proponent of the integration of rural healthcare and schools for this reason. During the pandemic, Illinois children were out of school for hundreds of days and many, many, many days. Think about this one thing for me. There are many children who never saw a health professional during the entire pandemic because they didn't see their school nurse. And you think that they always see that school nurse because they skinned their arm. But as soon as they skin their arm, the school nurse has her or his eyes on that child. They also didn't see dental care. So many places that had dental care coming to the school through a portable system. For that entire pandemic, many of those children saw no support for dental or health care. My sister is a longtime healthcare professional. She was vice president of SSM Health, one of the largest healthcare companies in this country. We talked often about the need to have high quality nursing care in schools, because think about the number of families you could impact. Think about the number of children you could impact. So if we ever find the magic pill and model and money to get a small clinic in every school that we can put it in a rural community, the healthcare of that community will improve significantly. And that's a little pipe dream and plug, but I truly believe in it. I think children really lost out during the pandemic on a number of areas that we just didn't think about. We just thought they were not in school, but in fact, they suffered from mental health, physical health, dental health, and also social emotional health, trying to connect with each other. So just wanted to share that. Laura and I have talked over the years many times about the work in healthcare and how important it is.
Dave, another question was popped up. What might change with the new federal administration's plans for changing or eliminating the Department of Education?
So I'm an optimist, and I'm going to be an optimist. This country has had elections for hundreds of years, and we've traded parties many, many times. It is a unique situation we're in. We have been in it once before with the same transition. But what I'll share with you, my viewpoint is this. First of all, education is I'm reminded oftentimes, a 500-year stalwart of our country. It's been around forever. Congress controls much of what's happened related to education being a part of our governmental system. And so to undo it, you're going to have to undo Congress's perspective on the value of education on many parts of it. And so we still stand firm on that our educational system at the federal level, controlled by Congress and poked around by the president and others, is still a system that can withstand the test of time. Will it see some changes? Could it see some changes? I guess it could, and I guess it might, and I guess it will in some ways. It probably has before, and we've just forgotten those because what I've told is voters have short memories, so we forget what happened the last time and the last time and the time before. But here's my piece of advice. I've known a lot of New Yorkers in my life. And you notice I'm not using anybody's names, and I'm not going to use anybody's names, but I've known a lot of New Yorkers in my time, and I've known a lot of businessmen in my time. And the best way to get you to take your eye off the ball of what's important is to throw rabbits out there and let them run down holes and see how many of them you will chase. And I want to stay focused on the things that I know for sure that we have an opportunity to impact. I know for certain that this administration believes career technical education is important. I know for certain that they believe getting people to work is important. I believe that there will be some funding that will come for opportunities for us to enhance that sort of work. What I also know is it might not come through the education system. And so instead of losing sight of the ball and chasing the rabbit down a hole, I'm going to watch where those opportunities come from. And as I said earlier, they may come from labor. They may come from economic development. They might come from healthcare. I mean, honestly, the best way to produce nurses is not do it through a school, it's do it through the healthcare system. I mean, so what I would encourage people to do is to try to remain optimistic, try to remain vigilant with your eyes wide open. Try not to get caught up in, I call it the whack-a-mole game. Don't get caught up chasing those whack-a-moles. Focus on what's important to you. Find where those opportunities exist. Stay very, very directed on those opportunities. We at the NREA are locked in. We are calling out all of our chips to find our people that were involved last time, so we know what we have to do to be ready. We are prepared to advocate with the new administration in however they choose to operate. But you won't see me with a little hammer in my hand looking for a whack-a-mole or a rabbit. I'm going to be locked in. At the state level, I think the same thing applies. I think we, as our General Assembly, I think our governor's office and their staff, I think Martin Torres's office is locked in. He's paying attention. He's aware of what we're in for. And I think just working towards what is best for Illinois' children, getting in conversations and arguments, what works for California or Texas or New York or anybody else for that matter, those are fine conversations to have. But what do we need? What does Illinois need to help our children? Where's our best opportunity? And so stay focused on what your needs are. Stay encouraged about what the work you do. And it's hard. I get it. Trust me. I get down in that other place occasionally and get kind of discouraged. But I am hopeful that there's going to be opportunities for us to improve education in Illinois. And honestly, we have to work together. We have to work across the aisle. We have to work hand in hand, and we have to be a strong state and an advocate for our education system in Illinois. And that'll be the most important thing we do, I believe.
Well, I would say that unless there are any more questions, that was a terrific summary of today's session, Dave. Really appreciate it. Any
Thank you.
final
Thanks for
questions?
inviting me. I hope it provided some information to people that maybe they hadn't thought about or they don't have. And Laura, I'll work with you, get the information put together that we should share back out so people have access to that as well.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's just some closing notes. As I mentioned, anybody who's here, if you want to receive the presentation materials but weren't registered, let us know. Drop the email in the chat. Don't forget about our upcoming sessions. Laura had mentioned it when she made the introductions. Thursday, January 23rd, next week, Again at high noon, third program in the education series on reimagining rural education. Also, I always put out a reminder to folks to visit our website at go.illinois.edu/LGE to access the video archives on prior presentations on a whole host of community development topics. And Dave, you had mentioned your economic development study. If you wouldn't mind sharing a link to that or a PDF of that when you send over our slides, we'll make that available. And we'll also have it available for other folks in the economic development fields. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. Thanks so much to you, Dave, for your expertise, insight, and time. We wish you all a great and very warm day, warmer, and we hope to see you back for future sessions. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right.